Good evening, everyone. My name is Sarah Gerner. I'm the Cultural Program Coordinator at Deutsches Haus, and I just wanted to say a very brief welcome to everyone. We're so delighted to have you here for tonight's panel discussion entitled Welcome to the Occupation, Squatting, and Resistance from Berlin to New York, which we are happy to present in collaboration with the Urban Democracy Lab. And so I'm actually really just going to say a few brief words of thanks and then hand it over to Becky Amato from the Urban Democracy Lab. We wanted to thank the DAAD, the German Academic Exchange Service, for their continued support of our academic programming. And so without them, a lot of our programming wouldn't be possible. Secondly, I wanted to say a big thank you to Becky Amato and the Urban Democracy Lab for putting together this event, basically. I mean, I say it's a collaboration, but Becky does such amazing work with this, and this wonderful panel wouldn't have come together without her. So I'm about to hand things over to her. I also wanted to thank our student workers and our interns without whom you wouldn't have chairs to sit on, basically. They really set up the room and organize everything here. And last but not least, our audience for coming and for your interest in our programming. And I would like to hand things over to Becky now, who's going to explain the setup and introduce our wonderful panelists. And please give a warm welcome to Becky.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming tonight. And thank you to Sarah and to Juliana, who could make it tonight, and Deutsches Haus and everybody here for hosting us, because this is a beautiful space. We don't always get beautiful spaces at the Urban Democracy Lab, so I'm very appreciative. So I'm Becky Amato. I'm the Associate Director at the Urban Democracy Lab. The lab is a few years old here at NYU, and we sponsor a lot of different kind of programming and fellowships around bringing scholars and practitioners and activists together in conversation. And so this is, an extension of that theme. So we're particularly excited to have this panel with us tonight. And I just wanted to say a couple of words about why we decided to have this panel. So, of course, we always have these international themes in collaboration with Deutsches Haus. There is always a German angle to what we do. Every year we do a project with them. And this year, as we have these larger conversations internationally around the precarity of housing and the affordability or lack of affordability of housing, this seemed like a particularly important conversation to have historically in a contemporaneous way. And so I'm particularly excited to have everybody here to talk to the topic. We're missing somebody this evening, unfortunately. Sophie Gonick wasn't able to join us, but we still have a great team. We are also joined, as you can see by the screen here, technology is serving us this evening, by a scholar from abroad. So I'll introduce him first. This is Alexander Vasudevan, who's Associate Professor in Human Geography and a Fellow at Christ Church College, the University of Oxford. He is the author of Metropolitan Preoccupations, The Spatial Politics of Squatting in Berlin, and the forthcoming, The Autonomous, actually, yeah, it's forthcoming. You just have a preview copy.
It's out in May, actually, I think, in the US.
Okay, so very soon you shall all be able to purchase The Autonomous City, A History of Urban Squatting. He is also the co-author of Geographies of Forced Eviction, Dispossession, Violence, Insecurity with Catherine Brickell and Melissa Fernandez Arigoitia. Vasudevan's research has been published in a number of major journals, including Antipode, Cultural Geographies, Environment and Planning, Progress in Human Geography, and Social and Cultural Geography. He has written for The Guardian, Open Democracy, and New Left Project. Vasudevan is currently working on a project that explores the history and politics of urban precarity. How perfect. Down at the end of the table is Amy Starochesky. She's also a cultural anthropologist and an oral historian whose research focuses on the use of oral history in social movements and the politics of urban property. She is the co-director of the Oral History MA program at Columbia University. In 2005, she won the Oral History Association's Article Award for Squatting History, the Power of Oral History as a History-Making Practice. And in 2016, the Sapiens Allegra Will the Next Margaret Mead Please Stand Up Prize for Public Anthropological Writing. Starecheski received a PhD in cultural anthropology from the CUNY Graduate Center, where she was a public humanities fellow. Her book, Ours to Lose, When Squatters Became Homeowners in New York City, was published in 2016 by the University of Chicago Press and was an inspiration for this panel. Next, we have Frank Morales, who is a writer, activist, and Episcopal priest, and currently pastor at All Souls Church in Harlem. A conscientious objector during the Vietnam War, Frank began squatting in the South Bronx in 1980. In 1985, he moved to the Lower East Side, where he was born and raised, and immediately engaged with hundreds of others in a burgeoning squatters movement, which at its peak occupied some 30 abandoned buildings throughout the neighborhood. In 2004, he received a Project Censored Award, one of two, for his article entitled Homeland Offense, Pentagon Declares War on America, about the growing consolidation of the police and military. As housing organizer with Picture of the Homeless in 2009, he advocated then and continues to advocate and organize for the occupation of vacant, unused housing in order to create homes and to resist the racist counterinsurgency against the poor known as homelessness. And then finally, we have our moderator, who we were very lucky to have in town this week. Pier Paolo Mudu is a geographer collaborating with the Urban Studies and Interdisciplinary Arts and Sciences faculties at the University of Washington, Tacoma. He has previously worked in different universities in the UK, Oxford and Reading, and Italy, Rome, and has been visiting in France, EHESS in Paris, and Université de Marseille. Also in South Korea, Sungshin Women's, you've been everywhere, University in Seoul, and at the University of Washington. The main focus of his research is on the development of contemporary Rome as related to social movements and migrations and the transformation of public space. He has written several books and published in several journals, including Acme, Antipode, GeoJournal, and Urban Geography. So this is an illustrious panel. I'm very excited to hear from you. Thank you. So we're going to start actually with Alex, just to give you an idea of what we're doing. We're going to have him speak, then we're going to take him down, but then he'll be back for a Q&A. He's going to be here the whole time. You just won't see him. Thanks.
Are you with me to get started then?
Yes.
Okay. Well, first of all, I just wanted to thank you for allowing me to speak via Skype, and of course for the very generous invitation on behalf of the organizers. It's a real honor to be part of such a fantastic panel and to address the topic of what is immense urgency in the current conjuncture, and the discussion about affordability and precarity around housing is certainly an international question in a number of different ways. Now, I think what I want to do in the next 10 to 15 minutes is say a few things about my work on squatting, about radical housing politics, and about urban precarity. And I'm going to narrow my sightlines, if that's okay, and focus on the book that came out in late 2015 on the history of squatting in Berlin. And I think the narrative arc for that particular book also mirrors some of the questions and conversations that I hope we can have this evening. As Becky said in the introduction, I also have a forthcoming book on the history of squatting here in North America. It's a sort of more popular account of some of these kinds of practices. And I may come back to that in my concluding comments, and perhaps we can turn to the discussion. But I thought, given the nature of this evening's session and the kinds of questions we're talking about, I'd focus on Berlin in my own comments. Now, if you could also indulge me for a moment, I think this is something I mentioned in the book as well. This is very much a book that would not have been possible without the tremendous generosity of the many archivists with whom I work across Berlin and Germany. So these are collections that mean a great deal to me, and survival and use are vital for how we might still come to think about and inhabit cities differently. And you could argue that in their longevity and indifference, we might detect something of the radical infrastructure that figures so prominently, I hope, in the pages of the book. And I don't think it would be a stretch to think of squatters as urban archivists, and perhaps as radical custodians of the city. And I think this is something that comes through really strongly in Amy's recently published book as well. And I think maybe that could figure in the wider conversation this evening. Now, in terms of the book, it's also a project that has a long gestation. So past 9 years, I spent countless months in Berlin. And this is a project that really grew out of the various conversations, the discussions and interviews that I conducted with activists in the city. And it's very much, I guess, written with the spirit of those conversations in mind. More generally, I would also add the book would not have been possible without the actions undertaken by squatters themselves. And I'm reminded of a wonderful graffiti quote by Nietzsche from Thus Spoke Zarathustra, which was figured on the wall of a squat. It's actually not in Berlin, it was in Freiburg, but it was around the same time. And it was, and I quote, "Man still have chaos in oneself to give birth to a dancing star. Man muss noch Chaos haben, ein in den Stern gewähren zu können." And I can't help but think that cities would become more just and livable places if we were more willing to accept this sense of creative disorder. Now, I think for the rest of my comments, if you like, I'll keep it brief. I'll say a few things about the book, but try to situate the book within a wider project that resonates with conversations or debates about urban precarity. So in practical terms, the book is very much, I guess, the first book length study in English of the cultural and political geographies of squatting in Berlin, and as such, it's a project that seeks to develop a thick description, I guess, a rich historical account of the various struggles in the city over the making of an alternative urban imagination, as well as a search for new radical solutions to a lack of housing infrastructure. So I guess what the book focuses on is really on what squatters actually did, by which I mean the terms and tactics they employed, ideas and spaces they created. So this is a history in turn that has had a significant impact on the transformation of Berlin's urban landscape and has shaped recent struggles of the city's identity, especially when set against the baleful landscape objectification displacement that, of course, many of us are familiar with, not only in Berlin, but in other cities, including New York, of course. And as I argue, squatters in the spaces they occupied were never incidental. They were never minor details in the formation and evolution of the New Left in West Germany in the 1960s, various social movements which developed in the decades that followed. They played, if anything, a vital role in opening up new perspectives on the various form, the substance of life that radical political action and solidarity could assume, and are supported in turn by figures that point, if you like, an alternative milieu which was made up of thousands of activists and an even larger circle of sympathizers. So in Berlin, if we look at this history, it stretches back since the early 70s. There have been at least 600 or so separate squats of a broadly political nature from 1970 to 2014. And the majority of these actions took place in the city's old tenement blocks, the Mietskasernen, they were known in local parlance. Though they also encompass a range of sites, abandoned villas, factories, schools, parks, vacant plots, and even in one case, a part of that death strip that formed the border between West and East Berlin. And as squatting was a form of illegal occupation, it typically fell under Section 123 of the German Criminal Code, or trespassing. Though many magistrates in Berlin, as well as elsewhere in West Germany, were reluctant to charge squatters, as in their eyes, a rundown apartment did not satisfy the legal test for an apartment or a pacified state. And more specifically, and as I tried to unpack in the book, there were really two major waves of squatting in the city. The first wave between 1979 and 1984, so there were squats earlier in the early 70s, but the first major wave was late 70s, early 80s, involved over 260 separate site activists and other local residents responded to a deepening housing crisis by occupying apartments, the overwhelming majority of which were located in the districts of Kreuzberg and Schöneberg. At the height of this wave in spring of 1981, it's estimated that there were at least 2,000 active squats in West Berlin, as well as tens of thousands of borders as well. Now, the second wave took place between 1989 and 1990, and it kind of shifted the gravity of the scene, if you like, to the former East. Hundreds of activists exploited the political power vacuum that accompanied the fall of the Berlin Wall, squatting from 80 sites both the former East as well as the West. In many ways, the scene came to an abrupt violent end, however, the eviction of squatters reminds us of November 1990. Now, since 1991, there have been only around 100 or so occupations across Berlin as local authorities have vigorously prescribed neutralized attempts to squat. Of these squats, 56 were evicted by the police within 4 days. Overall, 200 spaces have been legalized, and in 35 cases, the squatters have themselves acquired the foreign ownership. And while these figures point to the sheer scale and intensity of squatting in Berlin, I should add that they don't take into account other forms of more deprivation-based squatting carried out by homeless people, nor do they include the large number of East Berliners from the late 60s to the end of the German Democratic Republic illegally occupied in the process known as Staatswohnung. And I can come back to that point a bit later on. But in saying all of this, I think it was a surprise that in doing work with the backdrop of the German New Left in mind, there was really little empirical work on the role of squatting and the built form and geography more generally, the creation and circulation of new activist imagination, not to mention the production of collective modes of living, perhaps outside those usual forms of activist hagiography, if you like. And when I was interested, why did dozens of activists and citizens choose to break the law? Why did they occupy empty flats and other buildings across Germany and Berlin in particular? Were these actions dictated by pure necessity, or did they represent a newfound desire to imagine other ways of living collectively or living together? Who, in other words, were these squatters, and what were the central characteristics of urban squatting? In other words, what were the goals? What were the action repertoires? What were the political influences they mobilized and adopted? And I think, perhaps quite simply, what I tried to do in the book is develop three interrelated perspectives on the everyday practices of squatters in the city and their relationship to recent debates about the right to the city and the potential for perhaps assembling or building an alternative urban imagination. Now, the first one was really an attempt to, I guess, push back against challenge existing historical scholarship on the New Left in Germany by arguing that the time is to think geographically, to spatialize the events, practices, participants that shaped the history of the anti-authoritarian revolts in the 60s and the 70s and the early 80s. And in so doing, perhaps recreate or trace like complex geographies of connection, of networking, of solidarity that were at its heart. And so I guess the main point here is that this first perspective is predominantly a historical one, insofar as it represents or is predicated on trying to rethink or recenter the way in which the West German New Left and its various afterlives have been narrated or understood. And this is very much an attempt to respond to the kind of historical confiscation as increasingly shaped recent accounts of this period by self-appointed leaders of the movement, who in many cases have indulged in a form of retrospective revisionism, elevating their own significance while perhaps dulling the movement's more radical edges. So in that sense, this has very much been the sort of historical focus of this project, and I've tried to take a few risks as well in developing both the book and my wider interest in urban squatting. So, in the context of the book project, I tried to widen my sightlines beyond conventional ways of thinking about period, and to take in developments both before and after the fall of the Berlin Wall, while at the same time locating the imagination or imaginaries of squatters within a much wider narrative of displacement and dispossession that stretches back to the 19th century and a much longer history of creative destruction in Berlin. But I also chose to try to take the development in East Berlin and explore an alternative history of occupation that stretched from the late 1960s to the fall of the wall, and which has remained largely undocumented. And while the actions of squatters in the East differed, understandably, from those mobilized in the West, what was referred to as Staatswohnung played an important role in the development of a dissident public sphere in the German Democratic Republic in the 70s and 80s, not to mention the new wave of squatting that erupted in Berlin and elsewhere in the winter of 1989. So that's the first kind of overarching perspective that shaped the book and the wider interest in the history of squatting in Berlin. Now, the second perspective was particularly attempted to squat spaces as alternative sites of inhabitation that in turn speak radical differences of cityness, that is, the city's capacity to reorganize and structure the ways in which people, places, materials, and ideas come together. And so my animating impulse here was really to develop a more empiric, grounded account of the history of the squatter movement, which at the same time also was interested or committed to developing an original geographic framework for investigating and rethinking the possibilities of radical urban change. And so what I guess was really doing is trying to find a theoretical footprint that was key to developing an approach that challenges how we come to think about and inhabit the city. And also a theoretical footprint or a theory that was amenable to the practices, the everyday practices of squatters themselves. There's much more that could be said here, but suffice to say for the moment that any adequate theory of urban squatting in its various geographies needs to get to grips with the fundamental ambiguity that often characterizes life in these places. So in other words, the conceptual armature required must to a large extent accommodate and inhabit the reprovinciality of squatting itself. So that second overarching perspective is largely conceptual, one geared towards how we could perhaps align an understanding of housing scarcity and urban precarity with different ways of conceptualizing urban politics. And related to that, and it kind of brings me to the book's third main perspective, is to be just offer a thick description of the history of the squatting scene in Berlin, to document those everyday experiences, those practices, those sentiments of squatters and the role that they came to play in making of radical political horizons. And so what I tried to do was really just collect the various voices, the ideas, the practices, the knowledge produced by the squatter, while retracing the transversal path to revolt they themselves often follow. So what I try to do is really invite readers to step in with and alongside squatters whose actions were documented in magazines, in posters, films, and other sort of written and recorded in the white heat of the moment. And so I guess what I was looking at is really how squatters were able to cultivate an ethos of self-determination and autonomy, what I described briefly as a radical DIY empiricism, that focused on the rehabilitation of buildings and the active assembling of new forms of dwelling. One of the kind of phrases I use throughout the book and some of my other work is this kind of notion of a makeshift urbanism. So in other words, how makeshift materials and do-it-yourself practices combine with the sharing of food and other resources to provide the infrastructural and material supports for collective self-management. And so I guess the idea I'm getting at here is the ways in which squat spaces represent fragile combination of materials, of ideas, knowledges, and practices through which other identity and intimacies were performed, but also new commonalities and solidarities developed and shared. So this notion of a kind of alternative infrastructure that, emerged in Berlin's period was something that squatters actively produced. Now, just as I kind of wrap things up, it would be misleading to advance a dispassionate view of the history of squatting in Berlin, which was untainted by disagreement or dissent. The action repertoire, which was adopted by the squatters in the city, often varied from house to house. And there were significant differences, there were significant discontinuities across a long and uneven history of protest and resistance. In other words, the ability to act as a movement was not only dependent on the mobilization of specific skills, it also involved emotional labor. It also involved a range of emotional practices that played an important role in sustaining new spaces, infrastructures, and networks. So Berlin's squats were kind of spaces saturated with intense feelings, joy and hope, equally anger and despair, as squatters are moved by their actions and accomplishments, but correspondingly shaken by the losses and failures they also experienced. Now, I think I'm going to leave things there just to say that the three perspectives I very briefly sketched out, a historical one, a theoretical one, here's one speak, not only to their own contributions, but to some of my ongoing research on urban precarity. And much of this project, my work has been really under the shadow of a current historical moment. And so to broaden things out, and also draw my more recent book into conversation, I think it's fair to say that the recent necessitation of squatting and other occupation-based practices is undeniably tethered to housing scarcity and predations of a capitalist economic system. But we shouldn't lose sight that people squat for many reasons, and the ability to reorganize and reimagine the built form in our cities is one important reason. And I try to see these dynamics in dialectical tension. I should also add, in the context of Europe, it's hard not to sort of stress the importance of squatted spaces and the role they played more recently in offering an alternative infrastructure, a geography of care and empathy in the context of the ongoing refugee crisis. Now, all this set against the backdrop of intensifying criminalization, of intensifying repression, it's made it more difficult to squat. Though I would also argue, as a way of concluding, that there are new fault lines and connectivities. I'm really beginning to think about the links that we can develop as urbanists, as geographers, as anthropologists, and historians, and as activists as well, that promise to forge connections across the north-south divide, that promise other alternatives and possibilities. I think there is still a future if we think about the question of urban squatting. Priority of housing scarcity is very promising to take control of their housing needs. And I think that history is a alive and active one. So I think I'll leave my comments there and I look forward to the conversation. And I also appreciate your patience in terms of me speaking by Skype. So thank you very much for all of that. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
So I'm an oral historian as well as an anthropologist as well as a former squatter. And so I'm going to be playing some oral histories for you this evening. But to start off with just a little bit of context. It's funny, I can see Alex on here, but you guys can't see him. This is a map of some of the squats and squatter-related spaces on the Lower East Side drawn by Fly, who's a squatter and artist, historian, and a collaborator of mine on this project. The Lower East Side was home to a squatting movement from the mid-1980s through the late 1990s, early 2000s, really unlike any other in the United States. And that was because of the unique mix of influences that squatters were bringing together here in New York City, just a few miles from where we're sitting right now. They were combining urban homesteading with local Latino-led anti-displacement activism with inspiration from the Yippies and the hippies, from DIY punk, and probably of most interest for us this evening with European squatters. So there was a lot of back and forth between European squatters and squatters in New York City, and that really changed the dynamic of what people could imagine was possible here and how they went about pursuing it. So while we often hear in Europe of people sort of taking over buildings and living in them in a pretty normal way right away, here in New York City, the buildings that squatters took were really barely buildings at all. They very rarely had both a roof and stairs. They didn't have water, plumbing, electricity, drains, really anything that you would need to make a home in a building. And so I wanted to start off by playing you a clip from Rolando Politi, who's actually a European squatter that came here because he had heard through the grapevine of European social centers that the Lower East Side was ripe for a squatting movement. And so he's talking about what the buildings were like in the early 1980s when he got there. And the photo you see here is the entryway to Bullet Space, which is the building where he lives. And you can see some of his recycled bottle art framing the doorway. Can you tell me what the buildings were like, actually, when you first moved into them? Describe the physical condition, or what they felt like, what they smelled like, sounded like.
Yeah, well, yeah, pretty horrible. This talk about the smells, sometimes of dead animals, that kind of nauseating smell of a lot of muffa. How is in English that word? Mold, mold and mildew. A lot of that. Plus excrements, dried up ones, some not so dried up ones, which is not bad when they're liquid, like in the basement. In one building, there was a lot of shit taken out from the sewage area, but broken pipe. I remember going there with boots, big boots, but that not so bad, the smell, as long as there's water, humidity. They had this kind of musty, subterranean smell, kind of like Third Man from the movie in Vietnam when he goes and runs through sewage. On the higher upper floors, much nicer, of course, just more closer to the air. Pigeons coming in, freely. Talk about freedom again. Also, the pigeons had great freedom in those days. They were going in and out, open windows, open roofs. Yeah, apocalyptic, but also very interesting and free at the same time. Liberating. I mean, liberating. That's a good word. And inviting you to okay, let's get started. And yet, where do we start? But a nice feeling to it because. Because there's nobody stopping you from doing whatever you want to do within, the collaborative situation.
So Alex talked about the idea of squatters as people who produce new activist imaginaries of what cities might be, and we hear Rolando here talking about a shit-filled abandoned building as a space of liberating potential and freedom. Of course, there's a problem with that, right? That this wasn't a neighborhood that was empty. There wasn't nobody telling you what you could and couldn't do there. There were lots of people living on the Lower East Side. And it's easy, I think, to think about neighborhoods that have experienced abandonment and disinvestment and arson in the way that that neighborhood has, as frontiers, as places that are ready for resettlement. And of course, even if that was the imaginary at the time, when people came from outside of the neighborhood to squat on the Lower East Side, they found it was a neighborhood full of people, full of life, full of ideas, full of art and activity. And the interactions that ensued, ranged from collaboration and friendship to sometimes what looked a little bit more like guerrilla warfare. This is a picture of, just sort of show a bit of the kinds of work that squatters are doing on the Lower East Side. This is another picture courtesy of Fly. And you can see people, rebuilding brick walls. This is rebuilding the wall on the parapet at 297th Street. And I want to just briefly say a little bit about sort of the politics of legitimacy of squatting on the Lower East Side, because it's very different from the politics of legitimacy in many European cities, particularly European cities where there was a stronger social democracy. Squatting in New York took hold in the aftermath of New York City's fiscal crisis, when all of the social democratic resources and freedoms that New Yorkers had come to expect were really under attack, diminished. The resources to provide social housing had mostly been cut and taken away. And so squatters were not able to automatically claim a right to take city-owned housing. They had to really fight to make an argument about why they were legitimate. And you can see this is a New York Times article, and Antonio Pagan, who is one of the squatters' most vocal critics, says here, no one should have a God-given right to public property. No one should have a God-given right to public property. The infamous minority creating havoc around Tompkins Square Park are living out their revolutionary fantasies. They are white, middle-class young people from the suburbs hiding behind the banner of helping the homeless. And when we look at squatting in European cities, we see a same kind of dynamic of trying to set up a conflict between good squatters and bad squatters, deserving squatters and undeserving squatters, often along lines of race and class. So this is not an accurate portrayal of who squatters in the Lower East Side actually were. They were a diverse group of people from a lot of different backgrounds, many from outside of the neighborhood, but some from the neighborhood, squatting for a lot of different reasons. But because they were in a situation where abandonment was quickly giving way to gentrification, they were vulnerable to these kinds of attacks. They managed to hold on to many buildings for decades. This is a photograph of the eviction watch list, which is basically a phone tree that allowed squatters to contact a network of supporters to use a decentralized structure very effectively to call for support in the event of an eviction or an attempted eviction or a fire or whatever kind of crisis was happening. And on the right, we see something really important in the context of this conversation, which is squatters resisting eviction. Squatters on the Lower East Side were not shy about using direct action to keep their homes. And I think in part influenced by what they were seeing and learning from European squatters, they fought as if they actually might win. So in Europe, people would resist an eviction and actually fight back the police because of a different tradition of street fighting, because of police who were using different kinds of technologies, and because of a different sense that people had a right to claim housing that was owned by the government and keep it. And squatters in New York City really learned that lesson and learned it well, and were able to use a much broader repertoire of tactics to resist eviction more successfully than in other cities. And it's not that they necessarily were always able to keep buildings by fighting with the police, but that it was so difficult and so expensive and so dramatic to actually do these evictions that they were able to hold on for longer. So this is one of the probably most famous and dramatic evictions in 1995 on East 13th Street. And so I think in part because of this history of direct action, squatters were able to hold on to their buildings long enough that the city became willing to make a deal with them. So in the late 1990s, New York City no longer wanted to be the landlord of last resort. They were trying to sell off as much public property as possible, including community gardens and also city-owned apartment buildings. And it was really hard, if not impossible, to sell a building that was full of squatters that even the city couldn't evict. And so in the aftermath of evictions like those on 13th Street, in 1999, squatters opened a dialogue with the city using the Urban Homesteading Assistance Board, which is a nonprofit that came out of the homesteading movement in the 1980s. As an intermediary, and they made a deal to sell 11 of the 12 remaining squats in the Lower East Side to UHAB for $1 each. UHAB would then take out loans on the squatters' behalf to renovate the buildings, bring them up to code. Once they were legally inhabitable, the squatters could be acknowledged. The buildings were sold technically vacant, and they would become limited equity, low-income co-ops. And so it seems funny now, but at the time, people imagined that this whole process might take a year or two. In 2009, 7 years after the deal was announced, the first building completed the process, and that's actually Rolando's building, Bullet Space. As of 2017, there are still 2, maybe 3 that are in the final stages. Am I right? Last time I checked, it was 3, and I think maybe now it's 2. So this was a long, messy, complicated process. And I'll close by just sharing 2 testimonies from people living in the buildings about what this means to them, how they make sense of it. So this is Jeff Dan.
The city, I think, was forced, to make this, create this program, especially for us. And they were probably just like, what are we going to do with these people? They won't leave. They're not going to buy the buildings. They're not going to just someday show up and say, here's $1 million. We'd like to purchase our building. So they created this thing where they could, in a way it seems cool, but at the same time, I think the way they set it up for us is they're kind of like trying to set us up for failure, or at least weed out the bad seeds, and get rid of the bad apples and only keep the real responsible ones who can work and make money and give them money, pay taxes. I think that's what they did. It might be a big trick, who knows? Because the way I see it, we were all just a bunch of squatters, and we didn't want those responsibilities to begin with. So how are they going to turn squatters into responsible citizens? Can they? That's like a social studies experiment. That could be studied for the next thousands of years in colleges all over the world. How they turned a bunch of squatters into responsible citizens, tax-paying citizens. Yes, a few of them ended up in jail, but for the most part, we were able to break them too.
So, one thing we can talk more about later is the connection or lack of connection between Northern Hemisphere and Southern Hemisphere squatting movements. And Frank is actually one person that's helped me think about one possible way of connecting the two, and they're not as connected as maybe they should be, which is, thinking of these kinds of deals as really a World Bank-style debt trap, right? That this is not a clear victory. And the question of what the end game is with squatting as a tactic is not a clear or an easy one. So one of the things that made the squatting movement on the Lower East Side particularly unique is that its aims included but went beyond, and for some people didn't include at all, ownership or legal occupation. So there are many squatting movements that have as their goal to get title to the property that they're squatting, or to get a license, or to get a lease, right? To get some kind of legal right to be there, or to gain some kind of policy victory in the realm of public or subsidized housing. On the Lower East Side, there were people squatting who did not have that as an aim, who were squatting as a critique of private property, who were squatting from a far left political perspective or an anarchist perspective, and when they were offered the opportunity to become homeowners, did not want it. but they saw no other way to be able to stay in these buildings. And so that's part of what led to the process, I think, taking so long. And then the last person I'll play is Maggie Wrigley. And she also lives in Rolando's building. She's Australian, you'll hear.
We were accused of everything, speculation, trying to steal these buildings, of profiteering, of wanting, just to steal stuff and get over, and, we're all from out of town, and nobody was local, nobody had any commitment to the neighborhood, And that's the beautiful thing about where we are today, is because we can say that we are the only people that came out of this entire history that actually meant what we said. And we said it was about affordable housing. These buildings will always be affordable housing. And, and that's everybody that fought so hard against us, all these nonprofit groups, they're flipped. Their buildings flipped. They're all market rate now, So it's like all those, we really, I'm really proud, we proved that, what we were doing was, what we said and what we did was the one and the same. And it's took a long time to be able to say that we proved it, but it's a fantastic thing. It's like a gift to the neighborhood.
So I shared, Antonio Pagan's critique of the squatters in the New York Times with you, in part to give context for what Maggie's saying here, right? She's responding to exactly those kinds of critiques, that squatters aren't serious about making affordable housing, that they're asking for something for nothing, that they're thieves, that they're lazy, that they aren't really committed to the neighborhood. And so in closing, one of the questions that was raised for us was, is there a sense of history within the current movement and understanding of what has worked and not worked in the past? And I was interested to hear Alex talk about squatters as a particular kind of urban archivist, because squatters on the Lower East Side have been extraordinarily active in documenting and talking about their own history. They do storytelling slideshows with archival images. This is a picture of Fly videotaping someone speaking at a funeral for a squatter. This is Fly sorting and managing her archives. This is the Museum of Reclaimed Urban Space being built in the storefront of C-Squat. Oh, sorry, there's one more I wanted to show you. This is a museum exhibit in the storefront of Bullet Space called The Perfect Crime, an art show that happened right after they legalized, where things like roofing tools and now obsolete wood-burning stoves were displayed really explicitly as artifacts, as a way of documenting this history. And I think that Frank can talk a lot more about how this history has been used and can be used in the present moment. So thank you all for your attention, and I'll turn it over.
Okay, well, I don't want to take up too much time because we want to have a lot of time for discussion. So I answered a few questions. My son is a college student. He's actually here at NYU. And whenever he gets a paper, I always say to him, what's the prompt? In other words, what's the question? Make sure you answer the question in the paper. So I dutifully took some of the prompts that Becky sent, and I'll look at that in a minute. But I just wanted to say some general comments about, who I am. And I began squatting in the late 70s in the South Bronx. At that point, the South Bronx was synonymous with urban poverty, and maybe some of you remember, was visually kind of bombed out. And the whole question of how neighborhoods across the country became that way, I think is a central question that we're not going to address tonight, kind of the origins of homelessness and all of that. But in any case, I was working in a church and my contract had finished up, and I wanted to stay in the neighborhood. So along with there's hundreds of abandoned buildings everywhere, vacant buildings. And again, these are not walk in and make yourself at home kind of places. These are places that are really wrecked. You walk in, the roof beams are, out the front door. You're looking up 5 stories and maybe there's a central stairs, probably not. They're really, really, pretty bad. In any case, myself and a number of folks in the community started doing kind of what we felt was common sense, really, because it was the emergence of homelessness as a category, a separate category. We used to refer to people as former tenants as opposed to that phrase, because that phrase then became a sort of subspecies of another kind of person. This is in the 80s, the Reagan and homelessness and so on. So I learned from a lot of the young lords, people there. It was 100% Puerto Rican, primarily Puerto Rican people. My dad's Puerto Rican. So we began moving into these buildings and cleaning them out, schlepping out the debris, and doing what, birds make nests, people make houses. It's what you do. And so we began doing that, and there was some ideology around it, but it was really kind of folks coming from the outside. We had a number of folks who came from El Salvador at the time, and some from Mexico, from Tierra Libertad, who were squatter organizations in Latin America. And we learned from them. We were printing bandanas for the FMLN down in our basement during this period, and it was very exciting. In any case, I grew up in the Lower East Side, in the Jacob Riis projects on Avenue D. In fact, we were one of the first families in the projects, and I wanted to come back home by '85. So I moved back down to the neighborhood, but there was really no place that, the neighborhood was already beginning to become gentrified. So we engaged in a squatter movement there. People just, you'd hear every day people on the street. It was spontaneous. Hey, did you hear? People took a building on 6th Street. And, oh yeah, there's another one. It was like that. You just were moving around. And then little by little, we began to consolidate some around mutual defense. In other words, the only, the buildings were autonomous, and it was kind of the unspoken was that people who worked in those buildings, they controlled things. That nothing from the outside was going to tell you how to run your building. But little by little, as we started to have our eviction watch meetings, because that eviction watch list grew out of collective meetings. So at the time we said 10 or dozen buildings or so were going from 14th Street to Houston, we would have pretty much monthly meetings where everybody would come together, share tools, who's a good electrician, like who knows what, just kind of sharing stuff, people moving from one building to another, just collective. But really what it was about was mutual defense. That kind of brought us together so that we could respond rapidly. The idea with the eviction watch was to have a kind of rapid deployment force, because folks, I've been, last number of years attended a number of SQUEAK meetings, the European Squatter Network, and Pierre can tell you more about that. And folks there would ask, well, how did you guys manage to actually stay in the buildings? You got to build, very high premium on private property in New York City, and sort of super gentrification in the neighborhood, 40,000 police, and so on. How did you manage? And really, it's an interesting question, because it was a synergy of effects, really. Getting the folks out, very thin veneer of legal support around the so-called 30-day law. If you can prove that you've been in a building for more than 30 days through receipt of mail, then you're moved from trespasser to a tenant, to someone who needs to be evicted through some sort of due process. So we would have our mail. We would show, if the cops showed up independently on their own, they'd just walk in the beat and say, what are you guys doing here? We'd have an apartment on the ground floor with a little cot and a picture on the wall, and say, look, we live here. Here's, if you could just show that you were living there, not, you didn't have burglar tools and all that stuff, they would leave you alone. It was only when NYPD was receiving orders directly from the mayor that they responded the way they did. And, you know, we had a number of confrontations with the police and never really engaged in any violence per se. We didn't fling cinder blocks off the wall. The worst we ever did was to throw someone dumped a piss bucket, a fairly fermented pee from the which definitely scattered the troops, you know, but that was as far as it went with that. But through messaging and you know, lots of support in the community. You know, the neighborhood at that point was very diverse. You guys know the East Village, you know, and it was very diverse. Our buildings were very diverse. 50% people of color, young and old, some very old people, and some, you know, young runaways. It was a real mix, all kinds of people. Some who were, you know, dyed-in-the-wool, you know, anarchists and so on and so forth, and others who were there because they didn't want to sleep on a bench, you know. And it made for an interesting, you know, psychological challenge when you'd all meet together, and because all the decisions are made. Even you'd have a meeting and somebody would say, well, I don't agree with that. I'm going to talk to, you know, well, who are you going to talk to? There's nobody outside. And when it begins to dawn on you that, you know, you're it. Once you pass the threshold of being in there for a month or two or three, and you start to get the sense that we're good, we're here, nobody's coming for us, you know, and you get beyond that, then it really gets really interesting. You know, it's, you work on the building together, there's a certain kind of a joy and freedom that's very hard to express, because you realize that, you know, you don't have to work that job in order to pay that rent. You don't have to, you know, you can concentrate on your, you know, what kind of art you're doing, or what sort of academic career you'd like to pursue, or any number of things that you otherwise couldn't do if you were, you know, in that kind of wage slavery situation or whatever it might be. And you don't really understand that until you actually experience what it's like, you know, that kind of sense of freedom. Yeah, you know, we had occasionally, we had to jump the light from the street, first from the street lights and so on. You know, it was a very difficult situation, you know, kerosene heat to start off, K1, pure kerosene, you know, like that. The ovens, we'd create various things, but to the creative, you know, it's just unleashed in this kind of situation where people just make ways in which to live together and work together and open up space. I was one of the folks who opened up Bullitt Space. It was abandoned. Tanesh, a woman who lived in the community, kept bugging us. She's the one. There's a lot of the women who were really pushing to open up these buildings in that period. And finally, we went, we opened up Bullitt, and I remember the first day being in there. And it's just like Amy was saying. I mean, you go, you know, we could put a community space here. No, it should be up here. No, it should be, no, I want to, and picking a place to live. You know, you walk through these abandoned buildings and you find newspapers from 15, 20 years ago and sitting on the kitchen table. You know, maybe there was a fire and everybody left in a hurry. You know, you get a sense of that. Exploring buildings along the Grand Concourse in the Bronx was just like, you know, kind of an archaeologist's dream, really. I mean, it's just, anyway, I could tell a lot of stories about those kinds of things, but we were able to withstand 3 mayors and the, you know, ill-advised, you know, guys from the NYPD who would follow orders, although a lot of them would say to us, you know, privately, you know, my cousin needs a place. Are there any spots in your building? You know, like that, you know. But, you know, it's just following orders, you know. But eventually we weathered it. Giuliani and his beneficence transferred title to, you know, we didn't have any control over it. They were city-owned, quote-unquote, although we always felt that was illegitimate because, again, going back to the whole politics of how neighborhoods became abandoned and vacant and so on, and then HPD, the city, came in and took over all of those properties and then kind of warehoused them and then brokered them 20 years later, you know, that whole process. So we never felt, and the way the buildings were taken, they set up a court process called in rem, where they brought small owners in and you know, taxed them for taxes they never thought they had, and so on and so forth. There's a whole politics the way these neighborhoods went down. you know, I refer to it as a counterinsurgency effort, and I'll say a little bit about that now. Anyway, so if you have any more particular questions in terms of the day-to-day life of what it was like in those conditions and how we managed, and you know, the group therapy that went on in these meetings, you know, there's just so many points of entry into looking at this stuff. Runaways, suicide, young folk, girl, you know, and then some people stepping up in the meeting saying, well, we're going to put be with her, and how are we going to take care of her, and all of this. I mean, we had it all. We had it all. In the Bronx, we couldn't meet. I mean, when we were squatting in the Bronx, we couldn't meet after like 3 or 4 in the afternoon because everybody was too lit. You know, everybody was too wasted. And, you know, and people got pissed off. Oh, yeah, and the blades would be coming out. It was like, you know, so we'd meet like Saturday at noon, you know, you know, in order to get something. Not everybody, but there's a lot of anger that was moved into this more constructive vein, you know, so it's different. There, the South Bronx was homogeneous. As I said, Latino population, Lower East Side very diverse, and in some ways more difficult to come to consensus because you had all these differing opinions and different experiences and so on and so forth. Anyway, okay, I'm going to read this 2 pages here and then open it up. Okay. All right, this was the prompt. This is one of the prompts that I got from Becky. Let me see. It seems obvious that a revival in interest around squatting and occupation has to do with the growing precarity of access to affordable and livable housing in cities worldwide. What are other reasons? Well, first and foremost, as they say, nature abhors a vacuum, and the millions of vacant properties worldwide beckon the landless and the indigent, the creative and the fun-loving, to fill that vacuum, to occupy the dead space of commodity culture and bring life and light to the dark recesses of capitalist accumulation. In addition, when we speak of a revival of interest, because that phrase kind of caught me, we might also ask, whose interest are we speaking about? It's like the Black Lives Matter movement. The state, as agent of counterinsurgency, is quite interested in black lives, i.e. in controlling them. Similarly, the property-loving capitalist elite interested in squatters as criminals and dangerous property outlaws who expose the weakness of their imposed order while at the same time building the base and the revolutionary consciousness self-evidently embedded within squatting, both as a concrete practice and a subversive theory. So of course they are interested. Witness the current upsurge in the criminalization of squatters and squatting in England and other places. There's very much interest exhibited there. As to the matter of precarity of housing, I believe that it is in this precarity itself, again the consequence of the needs and requirements of capitalists and their elite managers, this precarity and insecurity of tenure, which has become generalized even to the extent of precarity of life on the planet, that has fostered the conditions for a scenario, a personal dream, wherein the masses of truly indigent folks and those who fear becoming such unite together and seize and defend the readily available vacant housing as a means of survival, the most basic of human rights, as a means of self-defense, and truly as a means of building loving and powerful communities of resistance. So, in answer to your question, I would say this, that the current interest in squatting is first and foremost due to the fact that billions are doing it, that 3/4 of the world's poor are living in houses that they built themselves, on occupied land, and finally, that the appropriation of land, the most fundamental aspect of primeval human activity, giving birth to laws and lands, colonies and countries, treaties and constitutions, enclosures and private property, is, I believe, reconfiguring itself into one that replaces the present ruthless, the worldwide movement aiming to create and embody a whole new world order, one that replaces the present ruthless and fraudulent system for housing for profit with one derived initially and forcefully through housing for use, and later into a society of guaranteed housing for all, with the universal right to housing and the moral demand implicit in caring for one another, our neighbors, actualized by the way of squatting. Here in America, squatting is resistance, this is my personal slant on this. Squatting is resistance to the state repression referred to as homelessness, a slow-motion genocide like poverty, and that is most assuredly an interesting subject worth reviving. Why? Well, for the obvious ethical demands that ensue from a recognition of the suffering of the poor, the children and men who languish in the streets and so-called shelters, victims of a decades-old calculated counterinsurgency against the poor, a racist state repression designed to preempt the revolutionary, insurrectionary aspirations and capabilities of the poor, particularly poor people of color. Further, it is my belief that this war against the poor is precisely that, a war that begs the question as to the viability and appropriate casting of the struggle of squatters as a human rights struggle, subject to the norms of international human rights law and even just war theory. Finally, it is my belief that squatting is the antidote to Trumpism and the irrational fascism currently being promoted by the ruling class. Why? Because it allows for a concrete and organizable way to foster revolutionary consciousness while caring for our neighbors, striking directly at the ideological heart of the landlord-in-chief and all that he represents. Okay, what's next for occupations and squats? That was the next prompt. Just a little more here. Well, here in America, and particularly in New York City, it's really a matter as to when and at what point the pacified and bought off housing and homeless advocacy movement and organizations decide to engage in direct action with and in solidarity with the oppressed. Thousands of homeless people in New York City against a background of mass structural vacancies. Here in New York City, there are some 63,000 homeless people, daily suffering the indignity, violence, and shortened lifespan associated with homelessness. Mostly black people. They are, I believe, the victims of a calculated forced dispersal from the urban centers. Meanwhile, some 225,000 apartments in varying degrees of disrepair currently sit vacant in New York City. In the US, there exists some 18,600,000 vacant homes and 3.5 million homeless people. In New York City, a municipal-sanctioned urban homesteading program, this is what Amy was referring to before, this is permitted sweat equity programs. In New York City, a municipal-sanctioned, permitted, lawful urban homesteading program with funds drawn from the nearly $1 billion shelter industry, which harnesses the sweat equity of willing participants, could, if the political will was present, drastically reduce these numbers of homeless people in New York City. But it's not happening. Why? Because the precarity and the generalized insecurity of tenure is a political requirement of the current system, which sees full housing as a threat to the stability of the current arrangement. In other words, there is not the intent to provide or to facilitate housing for all, as this would create the conditions for greater insurgency on the part of the masses now stabilized in the base of their resistance, namely their homes. So, squat we must, both as a means of meeting the needs of the poor and us all who need a home, an affordable home, and because squatting offers the ideological door, I believe, through which the unmasking and undoing of the entire system of privatization of land and life, the basis of capitalist order, becomes visible and possible, vulnerable and ripe for overcoming and overthrowing. That's it.
Okay, I think you had some of the most incredible stories about squatting, and I'm here not by chance. I've been working for 15 years documenting the squatting movement in Italy, and I think what's happening now, what we are describing, what we are discussing, is not something that is just related to a minority. It is something that is related to a big, I would say, process that is involving our cities. And what's happening to maybe some of you consider a minority is something that is going to be extended to a lot of other people. I'm saying this because I want to introduce one of the first questions that I have to the panelists and to the audience. One of the things that has happened, and it was mentioned by all the panelists, is the fact that there's a production of a vacant building. So in order to squat, you need to have abandoned spaces. I mean, if there are no abandoned spaces, there's no squatting. In the last 30 years, in the last 40 years, I mean, I think neoliberalism is producing now a new set of abandoned spaces. And this is one question that I want to have with you. This is quite, in the European cities, the fact that you have a huge set of buildings that are available is something that has been increasing during the years. Just in Italy, to give you an example, 31 million buildings, 24 millions are inhabited, 7 millions are just vacant. Just an example, 7 millions, you were quoting 18 millions. Let's have some figures. And what we are talking about was mentioned before is also homelessness. And so we have a lot of different directions that we can have our discussion. Homelessness is something that is very important, not only in the US, but also in Europe. Sophie is not here, but she is working on homelessness in Madrid, where there was an encampment of 40,000 people in the suburban area of Madrid. But this is happening in other European cities. So migrants now are on the forefront for squatting in Europe. And there's a huge interest in what's happening because migrations are on top of the political agenda. And so my first question is on how you see the change of the welfare state. I mean, I know in the US there's very few processes that you can define as welfare, but how do you see the dismantling of the welfare state related to this increasing squatting activity? I think it's a trivial question, but I want to go a little bit further, and if you see the possibility to build some different welfare state in the future that is not for marginal people. At the moment, home problems are for 80%, 70%, 60% of the population. So it's not a classic 19th century welfare for marginal people. Now we have to think something different. So a word that didn't come from your discussions is about commoning. So the idea that you're building something neither public or private, but you're taking care, taking responsibility of what you're doing. And I think through squatting, you have a few examples. So my first question is on this, for Alex, Frank, and Amy, and also the people here.
Amy?
Okay.
I'll see what Alex wants.
And Alex, if you want to talk, I guess wave your hand or something.
I mean, if someone wants to go first, I can jump in a couple.
I can say a few words. I think one of the challenges for mounting a large-scale squatting movement in the U.S. is that we don't have models that are accessible to most people of thinking about how to decommodify housing. We still think of individual private home ownership as sort of the basic or the obvious way to provide housing for people. And as you said, we think of any kind of collectively owned or partially or fully decommodified housing as something that is either sort of socially marginal or only for marginalized people. And so I think that it makes it hard to imagine a way of really scaling up squatting to meet the kinds of housing needs that you're talking about. Because I think if we create a homesteading program that then people just have straight home ownership of the apartments that they're living in, the problem in the end won't be solved, right? Because we'll still have the commodification of housing. And so I don't think we have a model for thinking about decommodifying or thinking of housing as a common good or as a common right. And that's something that I think we can really learn from European squatters in having these back and forth conversations.
Can I jump in on that?
Sure, yeah, please.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say that in terms of sort of the scaling back of the welfare state, maybe I'll take a broad sort of European optic or lens on this, is that it certainly has impacted on the room for maneuver for alternative housing practices across, Europe more generally as well, whether it's Germany, whether it's the Netherlands, Denmark, or where I live now, the United Kingdom, where they recently criminalized squatting in residential property. And all of that is of a piece with the sort of the move to commodify and financialize housing in a whole series of new ways as well, some of which we saw in the context of the subprime mortgage crisis in the US, but there were various versions of that in Europe as well. But at the same time, that crisis also, I think, did stimulate alternatives. So you think, for example, of the PAH movement, which has emerged in Spain, which has been able to scale up people's actions in terms of tens of thousands of activists, often embedded in local neighborhoods, sometimes adopting squatting, but other tactics as well in generating not only neighborhood action, but sort of, a wide repertoire of debate around these kinds of issues. And we now have a mayor in Barcelona who emerged out of the squatting movement to some extent, though other radical housing practices as well. And broadly speaking, a mayor in Madrid who's relatively sympathetic to these practices for a whole host of reasons. So there are ecologies of practice that are emerging, especially in Southern Europe, that do suggest that scaling up is a possibility, precisely in a space where there is a very large vacuum in terms of the welfare state. So there are some interesting initiatives emerging. I think in the UK it's much more difficult, and again, that question of what dominating or decommodifying housing would look like is one that isn't necessarily a question that many people are asking right now. And I think a lot of the demands politically are more in terms of labor, so the conversations around universal basic income. But I think Frank's phrase about full housing suggests a rather different politics, which would be equally interesting to explore.
Well, first, regarding the welfare, dismantling of welfare, or throwing money at the poor, at the problem, in order to keep the lid on things. I mean, I think it was Francis Fox Piven wrote a book years ago, Regulating the Poor, in which he talks about the, in part, the growth of welfare at that time, linking it to the upsurge of protest and even violence that kind of got the goods, that resulted in this increased the war on poverty. Those of you remember those days and all of that. It seems to me that we've moved into a much darker period, really from the mid-70s. You cite, for instance, the Trilateral Commission report on, what was it, Crisis in Democracy. I don't know if you've seen it. It was actually NYU Press in 1975, which talks about the excess of democracy. The chapter on U.S. Strategies for how to deal with the distemper of the 60s and what had been experienced. And one of the conclusions that they came to was that this excess of democracy, Frederick Douglass pointed out many, many years ago, you teach a slave to read, and then you have to watch out. You see, because if you provide full housing, if you provide educational opportunity, if you move towards that, then what the trilateralists were arguing, it's actually Samuel Huntington who brought us the war against Islam, Islamophobia and so on, and so he's still around. I think he's still at Harvard. You create a desire, greater demands on the system, so that the police solution to poverty has become, and the prison solution to poverty has now, holds sway. So it's a much different situation now, at least in the U.S. So my sense is that the squatting movement per se, a movement that attacks the root of the system of speculation on land, which, as I suggested, the appropriation of land is the root of all law, of enclosures and so forth and so on, that it may not provide us in the immediate circumstances with, a model, but it will provide a context where we begin to at least discuss those models in a way that, can create the possibilities for real revolutionary change. Let's face it, we need to create laws, getting back to the, to this idea of appropriation of land and the primeval origination of laws. We need to create laws that criminalize speculation, that criminalize what the banks are doing. But in order to do that, we have to have power. We have to have, and squatting and a movement at the base, at the grassroots, particularly in solidarity with the very poor and those people who are suffering genocide in these shelters and prisons. It's slavery. Let's face it. I mean, this is a horrible, obscene situation that is, just ever present. And then we can begin to talk about some of these alternative models. And I think at that point, I don't hold any hope for any sort of reinstituting of any sort of welfare system, approach. Maybe, but I think at this point we're looking at, some strategies on the part of the those who seek to control things that move more, towards an outright eugenics kind of view, where we can just eliminate certain vast populations. I mean, they're no longer usable. This is my own feeling. I don't see anything down the line. Now, maybe with enough pressure from below, because I always feel that unless whether it's organizing locally, stopping evictions, displacement and so forth, we have to get out in the street. We need masses in the street. We have to create some real power on the streets in terms of the acquisition of land and keeping folks in their homes, occupying factories and creating social centers and so forth and so on, to begin to even get in the room so that we can begin to talk about alternative models and creating new laws, maybe through, different kinds of approaches, and so forth. Put some sort of action at the base of this thing so we can begin to articulate, get the smart people in there who can talk about those models and so forth.
Okay, thank you.
Can't even get in the door.
Any comment or question? Yeah, first you and second you, okay?
So I want to follow up with what Amy said with respect to our believing in individual home ownership. I believe that's a huge problem in this country, right? We bought into a narrative that says you're otherwise a failure if you can't own a home. And a home is a way to wealth. Well, first, I would argue, I don't know anybody who's gotten wealthy owning a home. It may offer you some stability, but it's not going to offer you any wealth, right? And I think that narrative is one that we have to dispel. And then I would ask, how much are we complicit in our own problems? I think about this a lot. And I'll give you an example of Detroit. Detroit is going through tough economic times, emergency manager. The story's well documented, right? 2 years ago, I went out to Detroit, Michigan Welfare Rights, who I was on the phone with when I came in, so forgive me if I was doing double duty. But they wanted to engage in a program. They have tons of vacant homes. And they thought about 200 families and 250 families and 250 vacant homes. So they said, Rob, you've been involved in Take Back the Land, come out here and talk to the people. So I started a presentation. And the pushback I got from poor people of color saying, we can't do that because that's other people's property, I threw my hands up. It is so deeply rooted, and I'm like, how do you undo that? All right? And I think the way to undo that, and it's just, I'm thinking a lot, because I just had some Brazilian comrades, took them on tour of Detroit, political education. I believe it's lacking in our social movements here. We don't do enough political education to bring people to a certain point to understand the struggle that they're going through. In Brazil, they call it formação, right? Formation. We tend to say here, we got to meet people where they're at. Well, to be honest with you, they're all over the effing place, right? But in Brazil, they say we bring everybody to a certain point, and then we move together to make social change. And then finally, I'll say, we don't have a clear vision as a social movement in this country. Anybody, any social justice movement you go to will give you the laundry list of what's wrong, what's broken, but nobody will give you an alternative vision and how we get there. They just go, blah, blah, blah. There's a few of us, and I don't want to charge. I don't want to paint the movement with broad strokes. I learned from somebody like Frank. Frank has been a long-time mentor and a friend to me, but there's a small group of us that are willing to take those risks, to move, and to have those conversations. So how do we get to that place is something that's always churning through my mind.
Okay, just for like a second intervention, then we react on this think it's important.
Yeah, it's a good question. It's not. I
Yeah.
don't know if I need my question. Do any of you know the exact legal protections for squatting in New York City? I'm actually very curious that. So different countries have different rules and probably even different territories within countries perhaps. So I know the Netherlands, for instance, does, Spain, England. And if there's a building that doesn't have a demonstrable owner, no lineage of ownership for a long time, and I go in it, do I have any legal protection whatsoever? What's the process to decide what happens next with it if it's previously public property, private property?
So let's start from answering this quickly, and then we move to the other.
I mean, I can.
We can both say there's not a lot to say. You know, there's.
You be really quick and say there's none.
Yeah, I mean, I remember years ago, William Kunstler, the famous lawyer, and Ron Kuby, who's since become the well-known ABC, what is he, the ABC radio guy, with Curtis Sleeveswa, as we used to call him. You say, Frank, under the capitalist system, you know, there's no protection. You know, it's basically, we were of the mind that we had to just defend ourselves through our eviction watch list and so forth and so on. But the 30-day law tactic worked for us at various key moments in the early months, you know, because I can send you our ABCs of Squatting zine, you know, which gets more particular as to how this is done, because it's like covert, going in and out the back way for the first 2 or 3 months, getting lots of mail, and then, you know, if it comes to where the cop is standing there, you show him the mail, and that usually it's, all right, you're not a trespasser, that's all I need to know, you see. Then the owner is charged with having to deal with you. So there's the 30-day law. I've been told that the 30-day law is not, the cops are just coming and rousting people out of their house out anyway, they're not going for it. But then again, I think if you've got an attorney and pushed it, it's like if you have a roommate and they're getting mail in your apartment and suddenly the relationship sours, they don't want to leave out. Well, I've been getting mail here. You can't throw me out. You have to take me to court. That's the 30-day law, you see. So it's in effect, but that's it. There's people romanticize this adverse possession, this idea of it's a common law notion that if you're in New York, if you're in a place and notorious and whatever, you're open about it for 10 years, and the owner knows you're there and doesn't evict you, and you're there for 10 years, and you can prove through receipts and testimony and so forth, then you can adversely possess. You know, there's that, but that's, you know, that's a high bar. But the 30-day law was, you know, it did come into play in our case in the East Village anyway.
That he talked about risk-taking. Is anybody here willing to risk? Like, is everyone here part of an institution or a corporation? Or would you risk your livelihood, like in filling a commercial space and having your own business and running your own business to, you know, that's not part of some franchise or corporation, because it's already worse than just the living situation, because they're talking about like, now the property taxes are now that a lot of commercial spaces in the city are being emptied. So, and the landlords are, they get tax incentives for keeping it empty. So I just want to know, is anyone here like taking those risks to do like commercial activities in the city without like an umbrella organization, like a corporate structure? And so it's kind of like you're already in the same boat because it's already moved on to the commercial spaces now.
Yeah, no, I think the question is there. It's very important. It's about private property. And before leaving the floor to Alex and the others, I want to say something on this. I mean, the construction of private property housing market has been a long process. One of the paradigmatic examples is England, where at the end of the 70s, the Conservative Party started a huge campaign to dismiss the council housing. And this is very well documented. And this has meant to sell basically the whole council housing in England. And they were sold with a very strong propaganda, with a very strong narrative about the fact that people were going to be empowered, that the market was going to be efficient, okay, and that the state was not going to be indebted. These were the three main pillars why in England, but in other places happened exactly the same. And in Europe, you have different levels of private ownership. And paradoxically, 90% of people are owners in the Eastern former Soviet Union countries, while 60%, 50%, 60% are in other countries in Europe, in the European Union. But I think this is fundamental. I mean, if you want to address the private property thing, you have to start thinking about how that was constructed. And it was a long-term work. So if you want to go on the opposite side, you have to start a long-term work on the opposite side.
I don't disagree with you when you brought up commenting, it had me thinking about it. So the work we did at Take Back the Land, we always said land was fundamental to your struggle. And as long as it's a commodity, there's going to be that imbalance. So how do you remove it from the market? And you have to deconstruct exactly as you say. So.
Yeah, I think, no, Emmy, and I don't know, Alex, you want to intervene after Emmy?
Can I jump in on the legal aspect? Because there are just a couple of points I wanted to make. It maybe picks up on the point, I think it was Rod who was speaking about Detroit and in the broader context in which property and private property has become a kind of dominating totem in terms of the United States, but also here in the UK as well. And I guess the point I wanted to make is actually, I think in the German and the Dutch context in particular, there used to also be laws that prevented or to some extent prescribed certain forms of housing speculation. And there's not a really good translation from German into English, but there's this law that used to be the practice in Flensburg, which was in different cities in West Germany in particular, which was really a law that tackled property owners who were not respecting the use of that property, the use value of that property as a home. There were various, legal prescriptions with that in mind, but all of that, as we move into the sort of neoliberal phase of urban development has been foreclosed, if you like. And so, in that sense, there has been a shift. The point that Pier Paolo is making about property as a process, I think is a really important part of the story. And I can't stress enough also in the UK context, the role that the recent criminalization of squatting in residential properties has played in terms of, pushback against a housing movement that was beginning to emerge in the wake of the global financial crisis, in the wake of the austerity urbanisms that you see emerging in London and elsewhere. So I think the legal context is really important, and that drive to criminalize alongside curtailing more, broadly speaking, progressive legal apparatus is a really important part of the story.
I was just going to say, in common law, there's the idea of usufruct, which is, and even in Catholic doctrine, if you're hungry, you have the right to take from the riches of others what you yourself need. I think that's the statement in the Catholic Catechism. And usufruct, which is the common law, if the fruit is rotting on the vine and you're hungry and, you can take it to survive and so on. Common law. Wouldn't it be amazing if we were able to, how are laws made? If we could, make laws that actually allow for the occupation of these vacant spaces, with certain criteria and all the rest, and also, creating decommodified models and so forth and so on. Yeah. So it's a question of strategy and tactics around how to create law. Ballot initiatives. To put it on the ballot in New York City, that, like that. There's ways. We just have to be really clear on what it is, what we want to achieve, and we can achieve it. But make common law lawful.
And I mean, there's a very significant effort in New York City right now to mandate that the city count vacant buildings, which is, a move towards an anti-warehousing law, which I think is not something that's outside the realm of possibility even here. One of the problems we have today is that vacancy is largely invisible. Vacant storefronts are easier to see because they're at ground level, but vacant apartments are often, they're warehoused or they're held by speculators or they're held as investments. It's not, big buildings with the windows burned out that you can see that they're empty. On a sort of larger scale, I think a big part of why it's important to really think about and pay attention to squatting is that it shows us that private property is not just like a system of laws, that it has a whole moral economy and it's a moral system. And if we go back even to John Locke, an early liberal theorist of private property, he talks about how private property comes through people owning their own labor, and when you put your labor into something, you come to own that thing if you can use it. And if you're taking more than you can use, you lose that moral right to that property, right? So there's a deep foundation in the system of private property as we all practice it for a critique based on waste and for a critique of speculation and a critique of warehousing. And I think squatters have been most successful when they've been able to make, not necessarily legal claims, but moral claims that have then led to legal rights, which is what we've seen here in New York City on the Lower East Side. That there is no laws that gave any of those people rights, although the adverse possession laws are promising and almost worked, but not quite, you're right. And so I think that squatting helps us to see that private property is not seamless, that even if it's hegemonic, it's not just about rights, it's also about responsibilities, and there are a lot of really productive angles for critique.
Yeah, and I think maybe later we go back to the question the gentleman raised about small business. Mm-hmm. And I think that's an emergent, very strong issue, and that makes us considering how we are developing our cities and who is in charge of trading, selling things. And the question there is very tough. I think it's very difficult to answer.
Yeah, I think really in some ways with the shrinking cities phenomenon, which you were referring to, this phrase, shrinking cities, there's some kind of criteria where 50% of the population of the city has left in the last 10 years. There's all this criteria. Shrinking cities, the UN has its own task force looking at it now and so forth. So the US leads in cities who fit this category. It's not only Detroit and Flint and so on, there's cities all over. And then there's Leipzig, and there's all kinds of cities throughout Europe. It's potentially a squatter's paradise. You know what I mean? It's like, what are the risks? What are the laws? Let's organize. Let's move on these properties. Let's create a geometry that then allows for these discussions to take place. But we don't get there until we take that risk. You see, so in other words, when we were going into buildings on the Lower East Side, people would say, well, what if they come and throw me out? All right, well, they throw you out. We never got a trespass ticket. Never. Because, now maybe things are different now, I don't know. But the reason being is that we would then go to court. They didn't want us to go to court because we would politicize the court. Give us a ticket. Come on, let us have it. And then we'll go, we can politicize the situation in the court. So we never did. So what is the risk when you think about it? I'm telling you, I'd say to people, you're not going to be renditioned to Romania by going into a building. It's not going to happen. They've instilled such fear in us. There are houses sitting in Jamaica, Queens right now. Chase Bank or its various holding companies in Houston, Texas are holding. They're paper tigers. We can take those houses. We can create a movement. You message it the correct way. I mean, you think the banks have a lot of good PR? Forget about it. I mean, we need a movement to take these kinds of risks and so forth. Yes, maybe they criminalize it, like in England now. That's why they're doing it, because they're trying to preempt what the objective circumstances beckon us to seize these properties and defend them and figure out ways in which we can create alternative housing structures and so forth. And raise the basic kind of revolutionary, radical issues of the decommodification of land and so forth and so on,
I think there are other questions.
Yeah,
first.
The one point I wanted to make is that in traveling through Europe, mostly in Germany and what was then East Germany, you can see a strong culture of what was called, like for England, they call them the Victory Gardens. And in Germany, during the World War II, when food was really scarce, everyone was given full reign to develop every piece of public land. Well, that was 70 years ago. Yet today, if you try to evict one of those garden family members off their property, I think you'd see World War III really quickly. Yeah. And I'm wondering how that affected the squatter rights for buildings in Germany. I'm very familiar with the building you were showing in Germany. I've stayed across the street from there many times. But in my particular case, I'm wondering how we can strengthen sweat equity laws. What I mean by that is that you speak about buildings in the 80s in the East Village being converted. I was one of those NYU students who went over to the East Village and took on 3 storefronts. And although at the time they were commercial, the landlord was in full partnership with my conversion until the building flipped 6 times in a year and a half. The last landlord, wanting me to act as super, also suggested that I would have to forcibly evict some of the tenants on rent control. When I said no, I was evicted. I fought my case up to the highest court in New York State, so I was a legal tenant at that point. But there were no real powers that would force the landlord into acknowledging that. So I was under harassment and legal fees. You know, I must have paid over $20,000, $30,000 in legal fees over the last 40 years. And I'm still in court with the landlord now. But in a reference to Al Capone, I was able to stay there rent-free for 24 years because of taxes. I think you might appreciate that. I had to do all the legal work myself. There was an organization called Goals, which you haven't spoken about, which did help people. But us in the storefronts we had to stay under the radar. But my legal phrase that I think you'll appreciate bringing it up was that since the landlord was duty-bound to give me a lease, but would not give me a lease, they also did not correct the C of O, the Certificate of Occupancy, which states that it's now a living unit as opposed to a commercial unit. And since they didn't do that, I was not a living unit. Since I was not a living unit, they were not paying taxes on that living unit. And because they were not paying the taxes on that living unit, my quote is, I could not pay rent because I would be conspiring to defraud the city of New York from its legal taxes. And that worked for 24 years until I decided to go legal. And it was the stupidest thing I ever did because they won't even acknowledge my address. They're withholding my mail, sending it to other places. The only 2 laws are withholding money from a landlord and harassment. Those are the only 2 laws that seem to work. And I think that it would be really hard to find buildings now that had no deed, no ownership. So where is the other side of that, of people who want to go in, like this gentleman speaking of, you want to go in, you want to do the sweat equity, you want to work and build something and build a community. But then what assurances do you have that once you build that and the real estate values go up? That building sold for $20,000 in 1980. It's now $6 million. What happens when the rents go up so high around you that, my rent is $800. My space is worth $15,000. So obviously he wants me out. How do you protect them? Those are the laws I think we need to strengthen.
Okay, just another.
Hi, I had a question sort of in the same vein. I'm a student and I'm part of the Urban Democracy Lab. And I was just wondering if you could speak more about how the history of community gardens are sort of bound up in the history of squatting and how gardens can be used as a space of resistance, I guess. That's a way.
So yeah, I think that throughout New York City, community gardens and squats have been really closely tied together. Many community gardens started as squatting, not that people called them squats, but that people, took that land without having legal right to it. I think a big difference is, and many squatters were involved with making gardens. Many gardeners were allies of squatters. There's been a lot of back and forth. One of the big differences is that I think community gardens are, particularly in the 1980s and 90s, were more easily commodified to produce real estate values. Squatting, looked messy, looked scary, looked threatening to private property, whereas community gardens are beautiful and attractive and increase real estate values around them, whereas squats decrease real estate values around them. And so that's just an important contrast I would lay out. Similarly to how the squats have been turned into limited equity, low-income co-ops, most community gardens now either have a lease from the city, which has been a long-standing program, or have been put into community land trusts as part of the resolution to a really successful direct action campaign that was led in large part by squatters. So, the one other thing I'll say about your question is that I think that one of the big areas for potential that hasn't been followed as much is making strong alliances with tenants. That when squatting movements have scaled up, it's often been because squatters and legal tenants have been supporting each other when faced with eviction or harassment, and have seen each other as being part of the same movement rather than being, totally separate strategies. If you look at the history of rent strikes in New York City, for example, when you're on rent strike, you're not that different from being a squatter, depending on how much you're following the laws about when you can and can't go on rent strike. And so I think that those are areas that we need to highlight.
You should also mention to her that the process, if you want to know the process, because early on in our block on 11th Street, we created a community garden. Green Thumb is an incredible organization. And after Green Thumb, there's Trust for Public Land. But again, you're going to go through a lot of legal issues. It is a squat, it's a land squat.
Yeah, and if people are interested in these issues, I think 596 Acres is an organization that works very effectively to help people get access to vacant land, not so much housing in their communities. And Picture the Homeless is an organization that has been taking a lead in the vacant building count and anti-warehousing legislation. So if you want to get involved in these issues locally, those are some groups to follow and get involved with.
Can I jump in? Is it okay if I jump in on?
Okay, Alex, quickly, there are another 2 questions coming.
Okay, very quickly, it was just a point about is in Germany and the relationship to the history of squatting, and I could just very briefly say that actually in the 60s and 70s, many of those allotments on the outskirts of West Berlin were actually cleared to make way for some of the large satellite estates like the Märkisches Viertel. There was resistance, but there wasn't as much as one might perhaps have expected. And one of the ironies is that actually the Märkisches Viertel, which is this huge 40,000 people I think live there, estate on the outskirts of West Berlin, is actually where the first squat was opened in 1970. It included people such as Ulrike Meinhof, who obviously later, actually only a few weeks later, tried to free Andreas Baader and became a member of the Red Army faction, so to speak. So the actual history of squatting in some ways is wound into that narrative, but in a slightly different way than one perhaps expects. But I thought I'd just fill in that detail to answer the question.
Okay.
I'm curious how, as technology has evolved, it has affected the squatting movement, particularly in regards to security cameras.
Well, the short answer there was that our eviction watch list, which as you saw there, was before we had cell phones. So we were having to rely on bikes and so forth. So that definitely helps out now in terms of being able to mobilize folks if you can do it from behind the barricade rather than have to be out in the street. Yeah, I don't have much more to say about that. I mean,
Many technology allow a huge networking of people. Like in Europe, there are at least a couple of websites where you find all the news and analysis about the squatting movement.
Yeah, there's that.
Squat.net. If you go there, you see what's happening all over Europe and almost on your time. Not on everything. For example, squatting for housing, people still tend to be not visible. There are a lot of legal issues. But squatting for social centers and for other activities, they're all there. So I think in this sense the technology allowed something that before was quite difficult. That's an international there are a lot of books and collectives. Alex published a book edited by the other fellows that were working all over Europe.
Right.
Myself the same with you and other people. It's just something that now technology is allowing and something that was not before possible. You can get a clear picture of what's going on from the bottom, I would say, from what the people are doing, what they're experiencing. And it's just not only from the top.
Yeah, the kind of, the educated folks who are interested in learning more about the squatting scene throughout the world, whether it's squeak.net, squeak.net, or squatnet, so there's that. The only thing I'd say in terms of the technology on the downside is that I'm of the opinion that in terms of mobilizing on the street, which you probably see it's kind of a big value for me, is getting bodies on the street. People substitute networking and communicating and so forth and so on for actually coming out on the street, you know what I mean? But in terms of that, all this other stuff about, being able to become more familiar with what's happening in different parts and so forth, yeah, clearly that's a value. But in terms of organizing, I think it's still a lot of face-to-face, door-to-door campaigning on the streets is really what we need to be doing.
But at the same time, I think in squats, there is one of the most accurate and detailed criticism on smart cities, on how the technology is changing behavior of people. There are ARC labs in most of the squat centers, social centers in Europe. And I think most of the most interesting debate on privacy, how it has changed, how people are now exposed constantly, and the visibility of people, there you can find a debate. And the only demonstration, as far as I know, about these things were organized by squat spaces. Very few demonstrations were organized by NGOs or other people about the level of control that is now enforced on our lives, the level of surveillance that we have, the constant monitoring of all our activities. And that's, I think, one lesson that people there in the squats are taking seriously.
The only two things I'll add quickly is that I think that access to mapping technologies has become so much easier, and that's a big shift, that it's easier to visualize where vacant properties are. I was talking with some geographers in Detroit that are using a combination of big data and mapping to chart speculation in the city. And then, with just data on ownership being much easier to access, anyone can go online and look at the whole property history of any property in New York City. And that makes it much easier to find buildings that are in, some kind of legal limbo or that are vulnerable to squatting.
How do you... So I recently went to Albany for a lobbying day, and I was really disappointed by the number of people that were there. And I was like, most of the people here for lobbying day are people of color. There's not a widespread interest across across race and class, and there's not tons and tons of people mobilizing for things like universal housing and universal health care. And I guess this is sort of like an organizing theory question, and I know that you're experts on squatting, but I'm wondering what your take is on how being on the street is really important, but how are we going to take that to passing laws about this stuff?
Maybe Rob.
So I'm gonna, being a community organizer that works all over the world, I'm gonna put in a plug again for political education. We're not at the place where we create spaces to have the conversations where we should be, right? And that's where it starts, right? And there are models out there that we can learn from that are in other countries. Pa is a great example, right? I talk about Southern Europe all the time. Ada Colau came out of the housing movement in Spain, and she's now the mayor of Barcelona. So you have one of your own in those institutions. She hasn't been able to to shift yet because it's a coalition government, but she will get there, right? And I think we have to start thinking in those terms. How do we collectively, we have to move in formation, right? Formação, as the folks in Brazil say. We have to have some type of formation where we're all come to a centralized place or with a vision and how we can move forward. While I have the mic, I'm just going to take a quick opportunity to say there's a model in Brazil, because their constitution was written at a certain time, that says land has to serve a social good. The MST became such a big movement because there was so much vacant land all over Brazil that wasn't building houses, nobody had a house on it, no food was being grown, so they moved at night and they took over those lands. Now the MST is 2 million strong and the biggest social movement in the world. So there are models out there. Our social movements need to shed the exceptionalism that we do everything better, right? We can learn from some of these movements around the world.
I mean, if I could jump in quickly, I mean, I think the point about
Okay,
political communication is absolutely central and incredibly well put. And I think related to that also is the generating of connections and solidarities within wider communities and so on. And I think my experience more recently with a lot of squatter movements, perhaps in the UK, is the inability to really scale up in those terms and an unwillingness to perhaps think of goals and actions that may be uncomfortable in terms of sort of the language of squatting and so on as well. A more multi-tenure approach to housing activism that brings in the private rented sector, that brings in housing precarity more generally. I think there has been a certain exceptionalism around sort of focusing on very specific squatting-related goals, which has perhaps occluded the opportunity to build a bigger movement. Now we're sort of suffering as a result of that in some respects, and I think people are beginning to ask those kinds of questions, but a lot of that emerges imminently out of the question of political education, about asking very basic questions about why are people precariously housed and how can we do things differently. And I think we're not asking those questions in the right way right now. So.
Yeah. Amy, you want to hide something?
I mean, just briefly, you know, I think people on the left and in the center in the U.S. saw in November what happens when we take our political voices for granted and don't get involved. And I'm heartened by the sort of explosion in political engagement that's happened since then. At the same time, I still think that, you know, I'm wavering, but I'm basically with Frank that direct action gets the goods, and that doing something concrete to get what you want is likely to have a larger impact, and that taking visionary action as opposed to seeking incremental change or fixing the symptoms of the problem has been, just been shown to be what's successful in terms of social movement history. And so I think we're not there right now, and I hope that those conversations are bubbling up, and I feel that they are actually in this moment. That we've seen what a moderate left can do in the U.S. It can fail, so maybe we need a different kind of left.
Hey, I wondered if anyone had any criticism or praise for or just interest in the New York City Community Land Initiative, like the Land Trust project that's, I think it's getting started in East Harlem and is also trying to do some citywide creating of a model and some legal support, because it seems like, especially I think there's a lot of explicitly, like Picture of the Homeless, I think is one of the main, the main organizers, and it seems like they're really taking some steps with it by including a lot of vacant housing, but also, like you were saying, like one of the easiest ways for the powers that be to defeat a movement is to tell them, oh, you won, here's some stuff, and then kind of box people into what might turn out to be a long-term loss. And, are land trusts maybe more or less susceptible to that, or is it kind of too soon to say?
Yeah, my own feeling about some of that is, I think it's not one or the other. I think we want both. I mean, and in terms of this kind of adventurous characterization that I'm acquired here in terms of direct action, no, I think we also need.
How would I get that impression?
I think we also need the political we need the education. So in terms of the woman who was asking about organizing, create forums like this here. You know, just do what you can in terms of creating opportunities for people to come together around specific questions that maybe you have an interest in and others are going to have an interest in. Show films. You have a university, you know, grab empty spaces, create spaces for education. It's very important. You know, I think that's really something we need to do more and more. In terms of this either or, you know, well, if you press and in the city, you know how they're going to react. They're going to try to buy you off, co-opt you, et cetera, et cetera. The urban homesteading movement, which was a permitted movement that grew out of this, you know, grew in the 70s and so forth, came out of a wildcat squatter movement. The dialectic between permitted and unpermitted is precisely that. It's not one or the other. You see, so PTH is talking about community land trusts and how to organize for around, you know, getting this accomplished. Now, for those who are you know, unfamiliar with community land trusts, this is an alternative housing model. It decommodifies private property and so forth and so on, disallows speculation and so on. But because I've talked to Tom Angotti and others at PTH, and Rob knows we go way back on this community land trust. For a while, seemed like everybody was talking community land trust, right? Which is good, right? But in order to have a community land, you got to have some land. You got to have the buildings. You know what I mean? They have to either be gifted to you, or some millionaire has to come and buy you a few buildings, and then you can turn them into a community land trust. So, you know, my thing was, well, let's seize some buildings, and then, you know, publicize, you know, in daily news. What do you want to do with it? Well, we want to make a community land trust. You see, and they're not going to show up unless you break a lock. You see, you break the lock, you go in, and you have the community land trust people articulate this vision. See, you have to have the property in order to do that. But clearly, this is a campaign, among others, that has to happen because it educates people. What do you mean the speculation on land? What do you mean the commodification of land? You know, all these kind of basic questions, we're just not aware. They don't teach it, you know, and we need to teach it. We need to educate people. So, you know, the young lords, you call it PE, political education. You got to, you know, you got to have that happening all the time. So whatever forums and ways in which you can stimulate that through films, discussions, bring speakers in and so forth, that's a very important task at this point.
Frank, I just want to add to that. When I first started working with academics like Neil Smith and David Harvey, and I started coming out and seeing things like decommodified land, I didn't even know if I knew what I was talking about. People used to look at me with like two heads, like, what the fuck are you talking decommodified land, right? You know, but it's something that's lacking, right? How do we educate the masses on that stuff? You know, there was a time when people pushed back and you said anti-capitalist this, anti-capitalist that, well, you're anti-capital, you're going to change the world. But, you know, now I understand use value and exchange value in a way that I never did before, right? And it makes a lot of sense. So you can talk that, you can put that shit down all you want, but it makes sense.
We thought we were decommodifying land when we broke the lock.
Exactly.
You know what I mean? Well, you know, we're in here, and it's ours, and, you know. And then actually, in terms of the squatter scene in the Lower East Side, I think it was one of those magazines had an article, I think it was about 1989. It was right after Tompkins Square Park, you know, confrontation we had with the police there and all that. Market rate, was going down in the neighborhood. So it actually, you know, the fact that we occupied these buildings had an effect on all of that. Of course, you know, in those days, the developers and would-be speculators would be walking down the street. You could see them a mile away. They have their little chart. They're looking at addresses. They're looking at, you know, buildings, and they're taking notes. And we had campaigns of dissuasion, right? You know, we don't want you here kind of campaigns. But, you know, you have to do both. For me, it's not one or the other. I mean, if we can build a campaign, that's why, even in terms of urban homesteading and creating a sweat equity program here in New York, if we can get de Blasio and company to say, all right, we're going to eminent domain a dozen houses in Jamaica and create an urban homesteading. This is a permitted way for folks to go in using sweat equity. You know, their muscles to go in there, renovate the house, and then be given the house after 3-4 years. You know, they monitor it, you give them reports and all that. So For me, you get, 50, 60 people who are living on the street. They're in there. All right, so that's all you're going to get, and you think you're going to buy some. No, you just go from there and you go for some more. You got to keep educating people along the way as to what the real goals are. I don't think it's one or the other.
Okay, I think we are approaching the end, and I just ask Alex that if you want to add something, but just 30 seconds before we close the communication here.
No, one of the things I've been struck by in my research, and it's a quote I use actually in the forthcoming book, is a slogan that squatters in Copenhagen used in the district of Nørrebro, which was the best barricade we could ever build was our neighbors. And I think there's a sort of sense that the making of radical political spaces is a collective process, and direct action is a very important part of that process. But it is about building solidarity, it's about building new communities. And we see that in that history, whether it's in Europe or North America, or perhaps even more importantly in the global South. And so I think the conversation begins with that process of making these kinds of connections. I think it is about political education, but it is about action ultimately. So maybe I'll just leave it with that. So.
Okay, thank you. Amy, do you want to add anything?
No, I think it's a good place to end.
Okay, well, I have to thank everybody for the attention and concentration on this talk that I think gave you some ideas of how to build a different city. A city where there's culture in the sense of people thinking about their lives together, so not buying their thoughts, their opinions from TVs or from big corporations. I think this is something that is coming from further discussions, how we build cities where people are thinking how to develop the place where they are inhabiting. So thank you very much for inviting me and having shared this incredible discussion with you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, you guys.